Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews, in particular, found it was no joke when he received a telephone call from Admiral King, who had apparently just been talking to Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. Everyone concerned was extremely hot under the collar. Admiral King had assured the civilian authorities that New York was not under attack, but when the civilians wanted to know just what was happening, the commander-in-chief could not tell them. During the next few hours, all the Army air bases were checked out, and all the Coast Guard and Navy air stations were asked to account for their aircraft. Inexorably, the finger moved toward Trenton, and only here were their planes unaccounted for. Ensign Leo Ziola and Ensign John Tetz had filed Trenton local flight plans before taking off that day. Did they go up over Trenton and stay up there? That was the question. It was asked next morning when all the pilots reported to the flight line after breakfast. They were sent to the operations office and lined up. An officer came forward and asked each pilot, "Were you there?" Every man vigorously denied any knowledge of New York City on the day before. "All right," said the operations officer. "You will each write out a statement and you will sign it." All did so, but before the morning was over, several of the culprits realized that they had perjured themselves in a legal written document and came forward to admit their part in the prank. The whole dozen were grounded immediately, and the confessors were shipped out where Ziola and Tetz did not know. Those who did not confess were not shipped away just then, but in a matter of days a military detail showed up, and the 4 remaining pilots, including Ensign Tetz and Ensign Ziola, were hustled into a DC-3. The armed guard stood in the aisles of the plane, and they were flown, under arrest, to the naval air station at Brooklyn. Ziola and Tetz did not confess, as they, alone among all those pilots, had their local Trenton flight plans to back them up. So they were put back aboard the transport plane and returned to Trenton, free of charges. The commanding officer at Trenton, however, wanted no more part of these particular birds, so they were assigned to a detail picking up aircraft and ferrying, with the West Coast as their ultimate objective. They flew down to Philadelphia and picked up modified FM-2s, and there Ensign Ziola got to talking with Ensign Tetz. "Gee," he said, "wouldn't it be nice to see Washington, D.C.? He had never been there, and neither had Ensign Tetz. Their flight plan had them marked out a large restricted area over Washington, and the lieutenant leading the flight of planes observed the orders perfectly. But somehow, near Washington, Ensign Ziola and Ensign Tetz, in the back of the formation, dropped out and flew directly over the White House, nice and low, so they could have a good look. Then they poured on the speed and caught up, and next time the flight leader looked around, it was as though they had never been out of formation. The telephones at the newspapers, radio stations, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the White House, the Pentagon, Navy Annex, and the police department began to ring. High officialdom got on other telephones and wanted to know where the hell those airplanes had come from, and what in the hell was going on when the President of the United States was not safe from air attack even by his own troops. Soon after, Ziola was assigned sea duty and sent to Barbers Point Naval Air Station in Hawaii, to the pilot pool there. Johnny Tetz soon joined him. They began making the transition into the F-6F Hellcat fighter, which was the standard airplane for the fleet carriers by the spring of 1944. But for these hot pilots, the F-6F seemed a tame bird indeed compared to the FM-2. After a few weeks, he and Tetz asked if they could not stay in FM-2s, so their orders were changed. They no longer headed for fleet carriers, but would become pilots in the composite squadrons that manned the Gambier Bay class escort carriers, for that was where the FM-2s were going. Ensigns Ziola and Tetz were assigned to Composite Squadron 10, and as Commander Huxtable read all this information about the travels of his new pilots, he also had access to the newest information, which dealt with the Empire State Building incident, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the White House flight. Nothing had actually been pinned on these officers, but the information was right there with their official jackets. Huxtable looked at Ziola and Tetz narrowly. "You are a pair of hot pilots, I understand." On his first refresher flight out to the escort carrier conducting the operations, Ziola turned downwind, made a cross-leg in approved fashion, and then an approach. The landing signal officer gave the signal to cut, and he did just as he had in the Great Lakes. He dumped the stick and dove for the deck. The FM-2 struck with a clang and jumped back into the air. The hook was 3 feet above any arresting wire, and suddenly he found himself floating at eye level with the bridge above the barrier and at low speed. He poured on the gas and got out of there, and miraculously he stayed in the air and came around for a second pass. Once again he got the cut and dove for the deck, and this time he managed to catch a wire and careen to a halt, and the Airedales rolled him around and back, and off he went again. The third time he repeated the performance of diving for the deck, bounced off again, and came eyeball to eyeball with the captain, who was glowering at this incompetent flyer. Into his earphones came the message, "Get that crazy son of a bitch back to the beach." And shortly after came a more restrained message from the Combat Information Centre, ordering him back to Barber's Point. After that, for the next 3 days he lived in a flight suit and flew practice missions landing on the runway and learning to take a landing signal officer's cut for what it meant, not to dive for the deck but to release the back pressure and let the aircraft float in and land. Finally, he got the message, went back out to a carrier and had fewer problems. So when Commander Huxtable asked Zeola if he was not the hottest pilot in the Navy, Ensign Zeola was a bit more modest than he would have been earlier. This probably saved his neck with Huxtable, for there before the squadron commander was a full report on all the incidents and a request from higher authority for an equally detailed report of disciplinary action meted out to the miscreants. Huxtable read bits from the papers and chewed Zeola and Tetz out unmercifully. "We do not," he said icily, "need any hotshot pilots in this squadron." Finally he had exhausted the issue. It was either keep them or send them back to the beach, and both young pilots looked satisfactorily cowed. "Okay," said the squadron commander. "You've had your last chance. From now on it's shape up or ship out." Pilot Zeola and Tetz went quietly out of the cabin and onto the flight deck to get some air. The men of the Gambier Bay waited. They knew now what they were waiting for, the day when the invasion force of which they were a part would move out to strike the Japanese. The men of the ship had liberty every other day, according to watch. The officers, too, drew duty only every other day, so for the ship's complement, luxury was the watchword. For the pilots and air crewmen of Composite Squadron 10, the last 2 weeks of May 1944 were occupied by tactical training. Shortly after the ship tied up, Commander Huxtable was called to a meeting in the movie theatre at Pearl Harbor. When Huxtable got there, he found the theatre filling up with officers from dozens of ships. A Marine colonel stepped forward, and the briefing began. "It was going to be a tough operation," said the colonel. "The Japanese had proved at Tarawa and in the Marshalls how valiantly they could fight, even when outnumbered and outgunned. The difference was going to lie in the quality of effort the Americans could bring to this battle. The Navy, Nimitz, Spruance, General Smith, expected the best that every man could offer, and he was sure they were going to get it. Let them make no mistake. Men were going to get hurt, and men were going to die. But the United States forces were going to take the Marianas and move on from there until they entered Tokyo. The colonel's briefing was inspired, and Commander Huxtable came away from it exalted. Then came another briefing for the airmen by Captain John Crommelin of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters Staff. That officer got down to cases. The aviators were supplied with maps of Saipan, and with detailed information about their mission, with battle maps to show where the American ground forces would land and their objectives. After the Crommelin briefing, Commander Huxtable began training Composite Squadron 10 for the task at hand, specifically the torpedo pilots. Commander Huxtable took his torpedo planes to Kauai to practice supply drops, in case the Marines encountered difficulties at Saipan, like those that had plagued them at Tarawa. Ensign Piestrowski was sent to aerial photo school at Barber's Point. From 1,000 to 1,500 every day he flew along the coast of Oahu Island, practicing high-speed photography. Other pilots from the squadron went to school to learn aerial mine-laying on the island of Kahulawe, and they practiced firing rockets on the north side of Molokai. This invasion of the Marianas would mark the first use of a new variety of rocket, and each torpedo plane would carry 6 of them. They also learned the use of napalm, the firebomb introduced by Admiral Harry Hill in the Marshall's invasion. The officers of the squadron spent much of their spare time at the Barber's Point Naval Air Station Officers Club, where they gathered at the bar to drink Barber's coolers made of rum and pineapple. 2 or 3 Barber's coolers tended to encourage somnolence or hijinks, and quiet understatement, Hemingway style, was in fashion. The young men would raise their glasses high. Hell is war was the toast they chanted, and then, with all the insouciance they could muster, they would chug-a-lug the drinks, quite unmindful that thousands of miles away young Japanese airmen were quaffing their sake in much the same fashion. Some of the American flyers would gather around the piano then, to sing Deep in the Heart of Texas, Waltzing Matilda, and Bless Them All. These were the only war songs most of the young heroes knew, and one day when one flyboy broke into Anchors Aweigh, the room joined him in a line. Anchors aweigh, my boys. Anchors aweigh, and then the room lapsed into embarrassed silence. Nobody knew the next line. General laughter covered the gaffe. These innocents forgave one another, for none of them had been at the war business all that long. Off-duty officers and men played softball, separately, in an old cow pasture at Pearl City. They went to the movies, some chaste girls in Honolulu. As May drew near its end, the tension grew. Seaman Heinel and Seaman Elbert Covington were on liberty in Waikiki one day, when a siren sounded for an air raid drill. They were sitting in a bar, drinking beer, when the noise began, and the shore patrols came in to order them to an air raid shelter in Kapiolani Park. The bar was full of sailors and Marines, most of them fully aware that in a few days an air raid siren would mean the real thing to them. They shouted at the shore patrols to go away and leave them alone. The shore patrol, outnumbered, called on the army for assistance. Soon trucks came lumbering up, carrying armed soldiers, and again the recalcitrant were ordered to participate in the drill. Again they refused, so the military polices and shore patrols began throwing tear gas grenades. One grenade struck a Marine in the head and knocked him cold, and some of the sailors began throwing the grenades back at the army men. A full-scale riot was only narrowly averted when the servicemen finally went out into the park, but they never did enter the shelter. During the last 2 or 3 days of May, everyone knew the Gambier Bay was about to sail. Trucks brought fresh provisions, a sure sign of departure within 72 hours. The word got out that grape juice was a good vitamin supplement, and the officers went out by the dozen to buy grape juice at the Navy Exchange. The enlisted men also had juice on their minds, but of another sort. Some men came aboard carrying bottles. 3 Feathers whiskey, gin and rum, which were promptly confiscated by the officers of the deck. Naval regulations prohibited consumption of alcohol except for medical purposes. Some men came aboard with mysterious bulges at waist, armpit or trouser leg, all of which had to be investigated, usually to the discomfiture of the smugglers. A store of beer was brought aboard legally and promptly locked up in the ship's brig, which, in fact, was never used for any other purpose. The beer would be drunk on liberty parties off-ship later on. The junior officers and enlisted men still did not know where they were going, but had a pretty good idea from the scuttlebutt. On May 30, 2 Marine passengers boarded the Gambier Bay, and a crated Stinson OI-1 Grasshopper observation plane was hoisted aboard. So it was to be an invasion, that much was clear to everyone by the end of the day. With the invasion forces massed, Admirals Nimitz and Spruance were confident enough that they risked a breach in security by calling the senior fleet officers and pilots to a meeting and briefing them on the objective of Operation Forager. Admiral Spruance was in command. The Joint Expeditionary Force would be commanded by Admiral Kelly Turner, who by this time, after experience at Guadalcanal, the Gilberts and the Marshalls, was the world's foremost expert on amphibious operations. The small carriers would support the landings, while the fast carrier force, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, and the land-based Air Force, under Admiral John Hoover, moved far afield to destroy any enemy aircraft or warships that threatened the invasion forces. In all, the force consisted of 535 ships, more than 1,000 carrier aircraft, and 127,500 troops. Once the troops were ashore, they would come under the command of General Holland M. Smith, the Marine Chief of Nimitz's ground forces in the Central Pacific. The Gambier Bay was going to cover the Saipan and Tinian invasions of the 5th Amphibious Corps, which consisted of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. Another force would attack Guam. At that briefing, the major target, Saipan, was revealed, insofar as the Americans knew it. They estimated that 15,000 Japanese defenders would face them on Saipan. The actual figure was 32,000 troops. They also underestimated the nature and extent of the enemy's defensive establishment, and above all they underestimated the Japanese Naval High Command's reaction, which would be to send its combined fleet against the Americans. But that was the big picture, and as far as the Gambier Bay and Composite Squadron 10 were concerned, they would be part of a fleet of 4 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that would cover the beaches of the Saipan-Tinian attack force. First, the fast carriers would move in and plaster Saipan, Tinian, Rota, Guam, and Pagan. Then Hoover's land-based airplanes would strike Truk, Walaai, Palau, and Yap to prevent the Japanese there from sending reinforcements to the Marianas. The fast carriers by this time would be hitting Iwo Jima and Chichijima to prevent air assistance from moving down south. Admiral Mitcher's 15 carriers would mount more than 800 planes for this purpose. The strikes would actually begin on June 11, and on June 13, the Gambier Bay and the other ships of the Saipan invasion force would be in position, the old battleships and cruisers would begin the firing, and the air squadrons would begin bombing Saipan to soften up the enemy. On June 14, the troops would land, and then Composite Squadron 10's job would be to cover them and provide air support for the invaders and the invasion fleet. All this would begin for the men of the Gambier Bay on May 31. Early that morning she would weigh anchor and move out. All liberty would end at 9 p.m. on May 30. May 30 dawned Memorial Day, the holiday to honor Americans dead in a war nearly 100 years before. Commander Ballinger managed to secure leave for any and all men who wanted to go ashore, as long as the watches were covered. When that word came, the ship began to empty. An enormous beer party was held by enlisted men ashore. The officers trooped over to the Barbers' Point Club for a last fling, but not all of them. A few, like Ensign Pizdrowski, were affected by the solemnity of the holiday and by the enormity of what lay before them. Pizdrowski headed across Ford Island to Battleship Row and looked down into the water at the hulk of the USS Arizona. There she was, the broad deck outline visible, but only her superstructure rising to the surface. She had gone down, he remembered, on the very day that he had soloed for the first time in an airplane at Butler Municipal Field outside Pittsburgh. It was a very solemn young ensign who turned away and began to walk back to the Gambier Bay. That evening Pizdrowski remained ashore until after dark. He lay down on the grass near the ship and listened to the sounds of loading. He looked up at the stars and prayed that God keep him in the palm of his hand the rest of the way on the long journey. Suddenly he was pulled from his somnolence by the sound of the squawk box aboard the Gambier Bay. Ensign Pizdrowski, report to the quarterdeck. It was time to go, the war beckoned. Captain Goodwin told Navigator Gellhorn to fix the course for Roy in Kwajalein Atoll of the Marshall Islands. These islands had been captured 5 months earlier and quickly turned into a staging base for the fleet. Gellhorn was not familiar with them since before the war. They had been part of Japan's Forbidden Empire, and the Americans had very little knowledge of the sea around them. So Gellhorn depended, as he would for most of the voyage, on Ensign Albay Sang, a reserve officer, but one who knew his navigation. Just before Lieutenant Commander Gellhorn left the captain's cabin, Captain Goodwin had another idea. "By the way," the captain said, "while you're at it, you'd better prepare a Napier diagram." Lieutenant Commander Gellhorn merely nodded and left the cabin, and when he got back to the chart room, he passed the assignment on to Baysang, as if it were nothing at all. In fact, the preparation of a Napier diagram was extremely complicated, and if Gellhorn might have done it in his academy days, he probably had forgotten how. It required the precise plotting of data that involved the compass deviation, magnetic reading, and variation, to obtain a true heading in case of failure of the ship's gyroscope. No one expected the gyroscope to fail. In the navigation department, they regarded the captain's assignment as just another bit of harrying designed to keep them on their toes. Gellhorn said no more about the Napier diagram, but Baysang spent many hours with his slide rule and logarithm charts and finally produced the diagram. On the morning of departure, as usual, Captain Goodwin took his coffee on the bridge. As the land faded away that morning, Junior, his steward, came up with the captain's silver service and 2 cups, in case Commander Borries or another officer had been called to the bridge, and the captain felt like entertaining. Junior came up the ladder into the pilot house below the open bridge, a feat of balancing worth watching, and then on up through to the captain's station. The helmsman, boatswain's mate, quartermaster and bugler looked greedily after him, but anyone noticing would see that their greed was tempered with anticipation. As usual, no one else was on the bridge. The captain drank a single cup from the full pot and sent Junior back below. This was the moment the pilot house watch had been waiting for. Junior, a dark-skinned native of Guam, was relegated under the naval code to stewardship, but he really wanted to be a sailor. "Hi, Junior," said Bugler Deffenbaugh warmly. "Hello, Junior," said all the others. Junior flashed them a big smile and began to step around toward the ladder. "Wouldn't you like to run the ship?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, steer. You mean I really could?" "I don't see why not. He could do it, bosun, couldn't he?" "Sure, as long as Bell watches him." So Junior, in great glee, took the helm of the mighty ship. To do so, he had to put down his tray, whereupon 3 sets of willing hands reached for it, because it was well known aboard the Gambier Bay that the captain's coffee was the finest in the ship. Junior steered, the captain above unmindful, and Bell supervised, casting anguished glances over his shoulder at the other 3 men who drank coffee from the captain's silver service. Finally, the boatswain's mate took pity and made Quartermaster Haggerty supervise Junior so Bell could share the proceeds of their chicanery. Captain Goodwin took no notice of such shenanigans, even if he was aware of them. His mind was focused on more important matters, particularly the coming action in which he, his men, and his ship would be tested. There was still a little time for more training, and he was not going to miss a moment of it. They were travelling with a large element of Task Force 52, the Saipan invasion team. The Gambier Bay and Kitcon Bay began to launch planes in a battle exercise. Down on the flight deck, the activity began, as planes were brought up from the hangar by the elevators. Air Officer Borries passed the word to Lieutenant Waring, his assistant, and Waring alerted Lieutenants Pilgrim, McClendon, and Cridder, the junior officers who worked the flight deck. They would practice some fighter catapults in the course of the program. The fighter pilots, when they heard that news, began to groan. The catapult was an understandable necessity for the lumbering torpedo bombers, but Wildcats did not need catapults, or so they said. The captain said otherwise, and otherwise it was. So on the flight deck, the sailors in the green T-shirts got busy. The boys in the red T-shirts gassed up the planes, and the boys in the blue shirts began spotting them under the direction of the men in yellow T-shirts. Charlie Butterworth, Lieutenant Pilgrim, hummed to himself in the manner of the actor for whom he had been nicknamed, and gloated in his power. He would give the zoomies a little extra kick. Those extras would teach them to laugh and call his catapult a turkey. When the Gambier Bay turned into the wind, the launching began. Lieutenant Cridder ran up and down the deck, checking on everything. He was the jack of all trades on the flight deck. He lumbered along, singing blood on the saddle, blood on the ground, great big puddles of blood on the ground. Lieutenant McClendon, slim, intense, and worried over his charges, took his iridescent paddles and waited for the boys to come home so he could bring them down. On the bridge, the captain ordered general, quarters, and down in the mess hall, in the spud locker, Seaman Chenry Quinn was organising a little game. Quinn was a plank owner who had joined the ship at Astoria in the 1st Division. But after a few months he had been put on mess cooking, and he liked that duty, so he stayed after boatswain's mate First Class A.J. Smith, who had also joined the ship after service with Quartermaster Bell in USS Trinity, offered Quinn command of the spud locker. For a man of gambling bent, this was a choice assignment, with plenty of privacy and virtually no chance that an officer would disturb it. For weeks, Quinn had operated a game of 7 over-under, with the suckers betting and Quinn paying off. When 7 came up, he won all, if the bettor believed in 5s, and an 11 came up, Quinn also won, and it was a nice little hobby, and lucrative. But this day, as the alarm rang through the ship, Seaman Quinn tucked away his dice, waved the gamblers away, grabbed his steel helmet, and headed up toward his battle station. He was a gunner on a 20mm gun on the port side, and as he came up on the flight deck, the first planes were preparing to launch. All day long, the Gambier Bay and Kitcon Bay circled in operations. At dusk, the planes were called in, and shortly afterward, the Gambier Bay found herself in company with the large force, the old battleships California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Colorado, and 4 transports loaded with troops. Next morning, June 1, at General Quarters, Captain Goodwin gave the men of the Gambier Bay the word. As they all knew in their hearts, they were going into battle. First, he said, They would stop in the Marshalls where the invasion force was making ready. Then their destination was the Marianas Islands. They could be proud, the captain said, because this invasion force was the largest yet mounted in the war. The Gambier Bay's task was to cover the Marines while they landed on Saipan. They must expect attack by Japanese planes and perhaps by ships, for the enemy could not be expected to take this invasion without a fight. There was no question of the outcome, the captain said, for American might would win. The Japanese were going to remember Pearl Harbor when the Americans reached Saipan. That afternoon of June 1, the men of the Gambier Bay heard the general message sent to the invasion force by Admiral Nimitz. Their commander wished them good hunting and good luck. The hunting would not begin for 10 days. They could use the luck, but they did not have it. On June 2, as the planes of Composite Squadron 10 lined up on the flight deck for takeoff to begin the day's exercises, the guns of one of the fighters went off suddenly and struck an Airedale, wounding him in 3 places. The Kitkun Bay's planes and those of the Gambier Bay shared the tasks of mounting daily anti-submarine patrols and combat air patrols to protect their convoy from Japanese attack. The other planes of the 2 carriers flew off to join several other squadrons in wargames each day. They practiced aerial rendezvous and simulated attacks on their own ships. On June 2 and June 3, these exercises were carried out satisfactorily, but on June 4, Lieutenant Owen Wheeler landed his torpedo plane in the water. A destroyer was nearby, and Wheeler and his 2 crewmen were rescued. On June 6, the weather roughed up. Ensign Ziola, who feared virtually nothing, described his flight that day as one of the hairiest I ever made. He also lost 2 friends who were pilots aboard the Kitkun Bay. One spun in on takeoff and the other was killed on landing. Gambier Bay's landing signal officer McClendon had a rough afternoon, with the carrier pitching and tossing in a rising sea. Lieutenant Bob Weatherholt brought his torpedo plane in, but did not make the carrier and had to put down in the sea. His radio man, P.E. Collins, became the squadron's first aircrew casualty when he failed to emerge from the tunnel before the Avenger sank. On June 7, the pilots were edgy, Wheeler's engine failure of June 4, and Weatherholt's almost duplicate trouble 2 days later had made the torpedo pilots suspicious of the planes they would have to fly in combat. That day, Lieutenant Bassett's torpedo bomber also began acting up immediately after the catapult launching. The symptoms were the same: black smoke, which meant an oil problem. Bassett immediately turned and headed back to the carrier for a landing. Captain Goodwin looked on in shocked surprise. What was this pilot doing coming back immediately after launch? But Lieutenant McClendon saw the smoke and understood the problem, so he ignored grumblings from the bridge and brought the ailing plane aboard, safe and sound. Chief Montgomery took a look at Bassett's plane and found that the oil return line was rubbing against the firewall. A few miles more and the line might have parted, and then Bassett would have faced the same problem that had sent those other 2 torpedo bombers into the sea: a frozen engine. The torpedo bombers were all checked out, and the pilots began to regain confidence as no more incidents developed. But they had left Pearl Harbor with 16 fighter planes and 12 torpedo bombers. Now they had only 10 bombers. The 19 fighter pilots and 14 bomber pilots moved into a lifestyle that was to become habitual at sea. In the morning at Reveille, those who would fly combat air patrol and anti-submarine patrol were alert before dawn. Those who were not scheduled to fly went from their quarters to the head to shave, then to the wardroom for breakfast, then to the ready room, where they spent most of the day, listening to the squawk box, reading, playing cards, or napping. The food aboard the Gambier Bay varied, depending on who and where you were. The officers ate well, plenty of steak and ice cream. They were nearly as well off as the chiefs, whose messes, throughout the Navy, were always the best because the chiefs managed to scrounge delicacies no matter where they went. The enlisted men's mess was something else again, and from the outset the men had complained. Finally, out of Pearl, the grease and grit became so deadly that the word mutiny was mentioned, and the officers complained enough to Commander Ballinger that the cooks were racked up and the food improved. The Gambier Bay was shaking down fast, and on June 7, Lieutenant Bell briefed the ship's company on the nature of the mission ahead of them. Some of the material repeated the all-fleet briefing at Pearl Harbor before their departure. He repeated the warning that the pilots of this carrier were responsible for anti-submarine patrol and combat air patrol to provide safety for the whole Saipan landing force. He did not need to repeat the warning given at Pearl that Gambier Bay, a sister ship, had been sunk in the Gilbert's operation by a Japanese submarine, and that they must be constantly on the lookout. That day came another incident. One of the plane captains, sitting in a torpedo bomber with folded wings, decided he would make like a combat pilot. He pulled the trigger switch of the 50 caliber gun. Several 50 caliber shells pierced the flight deck, and one went down into the air crewman's ready room and sliced through a book in the hands of one man, then smashed through the deck and injured several men in a compartment below. On June 8, the Gambier Bay reached Royal. She anchored in the midst of what Lieutenant Odom called a limitless armada of American ships. Quartermaster Bell, perhaps a little less romantic, counted 7 battleships, 8 cruisers, 4 carriers, and about 30 destroyers, plus many smaller craft and transports. "It is sure going to take a lot of Japanese ships to put this task force to the bottom," Bell wrote in his diary, "and I don't think they can bring that many around." At Roy, the ships all loaded supplies and ammunition for the fight ahead. The mail came aboard, and with it an Alnav, directive from Washington, which brought word of a number of promotions aboard. That summer, most of the junior officers got promoted. Ensigns became lieutenants junior grade, and junior grades became full lieutenants or 2 stripers, and Boris and Huxtable became full commanders. The officers and men who stayed with the ship were moving along, so for that matter were some of the others, who had peeled off at various points. One of them, Lieutenant Coleman, was in command of one of the landing ship tanks assigned to this operation, and his ship may have been an element of Lieutenant Odom's armada. On June 9, the Gambier Bay continued to load. The men had to stop work 3 times during the day, for Japanese planes were reported to be snooping around. Snoop they did, but that was all. The land-based aircraft were alerted and took off, but the Japanese never appeared to challenge them. The Marianas invasion, Operation Forager, was already in motion. Admiral Spruance had come from Pearl Harbor in his flagship, the cruiser Indianapolis, to Enewetak. The 15 carriers of the fast carrier force were poised and ready to strike various islands around the Marianas to prevent a Japanese air attack from starting. At Roy, Captain Goodwin and Commander Boris went ashore with Commander Huxtable to try to bargain with authority for 2 torpedo bombers to replace the planes lost on the voyage from Pearl Harbor. "They would find a snowball in hell first," said the supply officer cheerfully. The answer was a quick no. If there had been any spare torpedo bombers, they were long ago spoken for by the big boys, the fast carriers. There was no other shore leave, except on official business. Lieutenant J.W. Patterson, the ship's athletic officer, organized his first boxing show to amuse the men. In San Diego, he had bought a ring and all the equipment. He had help from the old hands, who had seen dozens of Navy boxing smokers. When he called for volunteers, it was not a question of finding warriors, but of separating the sheep from the goats. Finally, they arranged a 7-bout card that supposedly pitted matched competitors. The ring was set up on the forward elevator, and the crew sat on the hangar deck and on the edge of the flight deck above. The ship's band was assembled and played between matches. Aviation machinist's mate 3rd class John Smurder, the ship's jazz singer, was the announcer, and Chief Joe Russell served as referee, and Commander Ballinger kept time. It was a highly successful promotion, and for an hour or so most of the men forgot what lay ahead of them. That day the crew also got mail from home, and in the afternoon the last mail was delivered into the hands of the censoring officers for shipment back to the United States. It was apparent on the evening of June 9 that the time had run out. On June 10, the Saipan invasion fleet sailed from Roy. Next morning the call to general quarters rang out at 4:30 a.m., and the men of the Gambier Bay ran to their action stations, while the pilots and air crews of Composite Squadron 10 prepared to man their planes. They would conduct anti-submarine patrols and combat air patrols to protect the invasion force. That morning, Captain Goodwin gave the crew a pep talk over the loudspeaker. Quartermaster Bell found it inspirational. There was a difference this first day of the Gambier Bay's war. The men had breakfast at their action stations. The ship was secured at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the invasion force steamed on. Gambier Bay's planes returned to the carrier after several hours, and flights from other escort carriers took over the protective action. They were all part of Rear Admiral H.B. Salada's Carrier Division 26, which also included the Kitkun Bay, Hoggett Bay and Nehenta Bay, and they would split the defence on the way to their objective. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Vereen Bell gave another talk over the squawk boxes, telling the men the nature of Saipan and Tinian Islands, and what was known about the Japanese defences. Bell was scarcely finished when the captain informed them that 2 Japanese planes had been sighted by the combat air patrol. One was shot down, but the other escaped in the clouds. That meant the invasion force must be even more alert against possible attack. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, once more it was Gambier Bay's turn to take the patrols. 4 fighters were launched as combat air patrol, and torpedo bombers went off low to look for submarines. They did not find any submarines on that day or the next, but on June 13 a torpedo bomber pilot from Composite Squadron 10 believed he saw a periscope. He dropped several depth charges, and immediately a pair of destroyers moved in and gave the area a heavy attack. They reported an oil slick on the surface, which, if not illusory, meant that the charges had sunk or damaged an enemy submarine. The bridge kept up a commentary during such actions as information was received over the talk-between-ships radio frequency. Thus, the men of the Gambier Bay felt very much a part of the action. Just before noon on June 13, Gambier Bay's combat air patrol was relieved by that of the Kitcon Bay, and the fighters landed. The wheels of the last plane had scarcely ceased turning when over the talk-between-ships came the word that the combat air patrol from the Kitcon Bay had spooked a Japanese Betty, a twin-engine bomber. They were going after it, the Kitcon Bay reported, and almost immediately a report followed. They had lost the plane in the clouds. The men of the Gambier Bay groaned, but then came another report. The Betty had just been shot down, and the captain had no sooner said the words than an enormous cheer went through the ship. That afternoon, Captain Goodwin hooked the talk-between-ships system into the ship's squawk boxes, so the crew could follow all the action of their force. He also told them that the next day, June 14, at daybreak, they would be 30 miles off Saipan, and Composite Squadron 10 would begin its attacks. After dark, the ship was secured, and those men not on watch turned in to sleep. They were awakened at 11 o'clock that night by the alarm and the bugler, general quarters. Quartermaster Bell was lying in his bunk, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He jumped up and into his shoes and hurried to his action station, the helm, and he was the man who would steer the Gambier Bay in battle. On the bridge, he learned that the ship's radar had picked up a blip at 4,000 yards. A destroyer was dispatched to investigate, and the whole force was standing by for action. The destroyer opened fire on the target, which returned the fire and then disappeared. Was it a submarine? The destroyer circled, dropping depth charges, and after a few minutes reported an oil slick. The task force now took credit for sinking 2 Japanese submarines. Had they actually done so? The best Japanese account of submarine activity, by I-boat Captain Zenji Orita and the American account by writer Joseph Harrington, indicate that Row 114 may have been the submarine sunk on the night of June 13, and Row 111 may have been the submarine sunk the following night. During the night, the Kitcon Bay and Gambier Bay left the task group and joined the Coral Sea and Corregidor, 2 more escort carriers, and the bombardment force off Saipan, and at 8 o'clock in the morning the airstrikes began. No Gambier Bay planes were lost to enemy action that day, although 3 cracked up on landing on the carrier deck, and 1 fighter was so badly damaged that the Airedales pushed it overboard. The troops were to land on Saipan on June 15, and the bombardment by battleships, cruisers and destroyers began 2 days earlier. The fast carriers were supposed to work over the Marianas beginning on June 12, but on the morning of June 11, Japanese planes were seen by the task force, which meant that the enemy knew the Americans were coming. There was nothing further to be gained by delay, so Spruance told Admiral Mitcher to go ahead. For 4 days the planes from the big carriers bombed and strafed the islands of the Marianas. They had no opposition until June 12, when a group of 10 Japanese bombers appeared but were driven off. On June 15, 2 more groups of Bettys appeared, but they did no damage and several were destroyed. From Admiral Spruance's flagship, it seemed unlikely that after all these days of bombing, strafing and naval gunnery, there could be anything left to worry the Marines when they landed on June 15, but they were in for a surprise. As the Americans had learned new techniques of attacking, the Japanese had learned new ways of defending themselves. They were dug in so deep and their blockhouses were so heavily reinforced that the bombardment had relatively little effect. The Marines landed and encountered such heavy opposition that they fell behind schedule the first day. The first airstrike from the Gambier Bay was in the air at 8 o'clock that morning. The first target was a sugar mill at Sharon-Kanoa. Commander Huxtable led the torpedo bombers and Lieutenant Stewart led the fighters. Huxtable had to give up the lead to Lieutenant Bassett midway in the approach when his radio went out. For several days, they had been hearing stories of the heavy anti-aircraft fire put up by the Japanese against the fleet carrier raids, and the bomber pilots were worried. But on this first attack, they found the anti-aircraft fire very light and came back to the carrier quite elated. All came back, that is, but Lieutenant Stewart. During a strafing run, Stewart's Wildcat was hit in the engine by ground fire and began to cough. He managed to nurse the plane out over the sea and land in the water beside a destroyer, which promptly picked him up, but he would not be seen by the men of the Gambier Bay for 2 weeks. There was no time during the battle to stop and decant stranded airmen. Lieutenant James F. Oliver took over as acting squadron fighter commander after Stewart's crash. All day long, the pilots of Composite Squadron 10 flew support missions. The other escort carriers had responsibility for the combat air patrol. Lieutenant Pizdrowski flew one anti-submarine patrol early in the morning, northwest and ahead of the carrier force. On his return, he and his crewmen had a first-rate view of the landing craft moving in from the invasion fleet. On their second scouting rotation that day, they passed over Marpy Point at the extreme north end of the island. Lieutenant Bell had briefed them about the enemy several times, and on the last occasion he had told them the defenders of Saipan were Japanese Marines, most of them 6 feet tall, and committed to death rather than surrender. Nor could they expect to encounter any friendly natives on Saipan or Tinian, the second point of invasion. The Marianas were a part of the Inner Empire. The housing, customs, and language were all Japanese. They had taken in this information, but it had not prepared them for the sight they saw that day at Marpy Point. As they passed over the cliff top, they saw men, women, and children holding hands, leaping from the cliff 900 feet to certain death. These were civilians, who also were determined never to surrender. Their deaths, before the invasion was well launched, were an indication of the amount of faith they put in the claims on the radio of Toiko Rose that Saipan would never fall. On the third rotation of their scouting mission that day, they flew along the bottom of Marpy Point Cliff and saw the bodies pounded in the heavy surf. There were hundreds of them. Aboard the ship, the men of the Gambier Bay had ringside seats to watch the battle, plus the commentary of the radio. Captain Goodwin had the pilot's communication band piped into the public address system, and they listened to the aviators talking. Admiral Turner had given the signal to land the troops at 5:42 a.m. that morning. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions were making the assault, and they would hit the beaches of the Charan-Kanoa and drive for the airfields at both ends of the landing area. At 8:44 a.m. the first wave hit the beach, and by 9 o'clock troops had landed on all designated beaches. They came under intense fire from the Japanese, who had constructed their defences with concrete and logs so that the firing range of one machine gun overlapped the next. On the mountains behind the beaches, the Japanese had placed 77mm and 105mm guns, and surprisingly few of these were affected by the 3-day bombardment and the heavy air attacks of the fleet carriers. By the time the 4th American wave of troops landed, the Japanese had begun to lay down a barrage on the beaches. In several places, the Americans were stopped, and at 10 o'clock, Colonel James P. Risley of the 6th Regiment called for his reserve battalion. That was an indication of the difficulties the landing force faced. They called for gun support from the battleships and cruisers, and Torchy called for air strikes as he toured above the battlefield and observed the movement of Japanese troops. Composite Squadron 10 sent its fighters out first to strafe, and then the bombers, each loaded with 10 100-pound fragmentation bombs. That evening, Tokyo Rose broadcast to the Americans and warned them that they would all end up in watery graves when the Imperial Nipponese forces descended upon them and destroyed them. Already, she said, the Americans had tried twice to land on Saipan and had twice been repelled. Knowing how untrue that remark was, The men of the Gambier Bay laughed at Tokyo Rose's warning that the Japanese combined fleet was coming out to get them. Just after Tokyo Rose's show, the general alarm sounded aboard the Gambier Bay, and it was back to battle stations for every man. The captain reported that a flight of enemy bombers had been spotted, apparently heading their way. But a few minutes later came the order to secure. Of the 5 Bettys in the Japanese flight, 4 had been shot down by the combat air patrol from another carrier. That night of June 15, the men of the Gambier Bay expected some sort of attack. They were worried and frightened, and many of them wrote letters to loved ones at home to express their feelings. "It is night time and very hot in 2 ways," wrote Ensign Lisher to his father and sister. "I must admit I'm scared, as I think everyone probably is. With some of my experiences I have believed in God more and felt him closer than ever before. I haven't turned strictly religious, but to feel him in there helping is a helpful feeling." Padre Carlson noted the same phenomenon that night. The ship was unusually quiet, and the men were unusually respectful and comradely toward him, even men he had never seen in chapel. Very few atheists went to bed aboard the Gambier Bay that night of June 15, 1944,